Have you ever thought about the people you pray to? What if I told you that many of them never existed at all? I'm not speaking metaphorically, I'm talking about key figures from the Bible who simply couldn't have lived as described. These stories were carefully crafted, not by accident, but with a clear aim, to control rather than to save. In the 17th century, a brave philosopher named Baruch Spinoza dared to question these stories. His inquiry was so controversial that it made him a target across Europe. He didn't just raise eyebrows, he faced a hunt for his life. So, what did he find? Spinoza discovered 7 characters within the Bible whose existence is impossible. Once you see what he uncovered, it will change how you look at these figures forever. You'll never be able to walk into a church the same way again. This journey isn't for those who want to cling to their beliefs. It's for those ready to confront uncomfortable truths. By the end, you'll understand why these characters were created and how they manipulate our thinking. Are you ready to explore this awakening together? Let's dive in. For centuries, you were taught that doubt was dangerous, that questioning meant rebellion, that asking the wrong questions could cost you your soul. But the truth is simpler and far more unsettling. You weren't discouraged from asking questions because the answers were complicated. You were discouraged because the answers were obvious. And obvious answers are dangerous when they undermine authority. In the year 1670, a man discovered just how dangerous those answers could be. His name was Baruch Spinoza. Spinoza wasn't a rebel. He wasn't angry at religion. He wasn't trying to tear faith apart. In fact, he believed deeply in God. But he believed something else, something far more threatening to religious power. He believed that truth should not fear investigation. When Spinoza published his work, he wasn't met with debate. He was met with violence. The Catholic Church declared him an enemy. Protestant leaders called him heretical. His own Jewish community had already erased him from their world years earlier, publicly cursing him in a ceremony so severe that it prayed for his name to be wiped from existence. Not criticized, not corrected, erased. Why would a man deserve that level of hatred? Because Spinoza read the Bible the way investigators examine a crime scene. He didn't treat it as untouchable. He didn't assume perfection. He asked basic, logical questions and followed the evidence wherever it led. And what he found shattered the foundation of religious authority. Spinoza realized that large parts of the Bible were not written by the people they were attributed to, not even close. He noticed references to events that happened long after the supposed authors were dead. He found contradictions that couldn't be explained away by translation errors or symbolism. He identified edits, insertions, and revisions added centuries later to support political and theological agendas. Most disturbingly, he discovered that several major biblical characters could not have existed as described. Their stories contain contradictions so severe that belief in them requires ignoring basic logic, history, and reality itself. Not unlikely, not questionable, impossible. And once you see those impossibilities clearly, something changes. You can't go back to hearing these stories the same way. You begin to notice how often explanations rely on fear instead of evidence. How often authority replaces honesty. How often the phrase "you just have to believe" is used to cover cracks that are too large to ignore. This isn't content meant to protect your comfort. It's not meant to reinforce what you already believe. This is for people who are ready to know why certain questions were never allowed in the first place. Because once you understand how these characters were invented, you also understand why guilt was attached to doubting them. You understand why fear was used as reinforcement. And most importantly, you understand how control was quietly installed into the human mind. And here's the surprising part. When you see the truth, you don't feel emptier. You feel lighter. Fear that was built on fabrication loses its grip. Guilt rooted in false authority evaporates. The pressure to submit to narratives that never made sense finally lifts. That's why so many people resist this information, not because it's false, but because it forces responsibility. Once you see the contradiction, you can't pretend you didn't see it. Once you understand the mechanism, you can't know how it works. And that responsibility scares people more than punishment ever could. Before we go further, I want you to do something simple. In the comments, write your city and country, nothing more. This isn't about tracking, it's about connection. Because people all over the world are asking these same questions quietly, often alone, often in fear. Seeing how widespread this awakening really is matters. You are not isolated. You are not broken. And you are not the first to notice something was wrong. Now let's go back to the moment everything changed. Amsterdam, 1656. Baruch Spinoza was just 23 years old when religious leaders gathered to perform the harshest punishment they had. The cherem wasn't just social exclusion, it was total erasure. No one was allowed to speak to him. No one could read his work. No one could help him. His name was cursed in public, morning and night, as though knowledge itself were contagious. And all because he asked one question. If Moses wrote the Torah, how did Moses describe his own death? How did he describe events that happened generations later? How did he mention cities that didn't exist during his lifetime? How could he reference political systems that emerged centuries after he was gone? The answer was unavoidable. Moses didn't write it. And if Moses didn't write it, then the authority of the text collapsed, because the entire claim of divine authorship depended on that belief. Without it, the Bible wasn't God dictating truth. It was humans writing stories and attaching God's name to them for power. Spinoza understood this instantly, and instead of stopping, he kept going. He examined the Bible as a historical document. He compared timelines. He analyzed language shift. He traced political motives. He noticed how later editors reshaped earlier texts to support new doctrines. What he uncovered was not a single mistake, but a pattern of invention, a pattern of control. And within that pattern, he identified 7 figures whose existence simply does not hold up under scrutiny. And once we examine them carefully, you'll understand why questioning them was never allowed. To understand why impossible characters could survive for thousands of years without being questioned, you first have to understand how religious authority was constructed in the ancient world. Authority did not come from evidence, it came from attribution. Whoever controlled the story controlled reality, and whoever could attach a powerful name to a text could make that text untouchable. In the ancient Near East, writing something and signing your own name to it carried very little weight. Writing something and attaching it to a legendary figure carried enormous power. That is why laws were attributed to kings, poems were attributed to prophets, and entire traditions were attributed to founders long after they were gone. This was not seen as forgery in the modern sense. It was a strategy, a way of saying, this teaching stands in the tradition of this authority, even if that authority never touched the text. But over time, something changed. What began as symbolic attribution hardened into literal belief. Stories meant to teach obedience were treated as eyewitness accounts. Allegories designed to unify tribes became biographies. And once that shift happened, questioning the stories became the same thing as questioning God himself. This is the environment Spinoza stepped into. When he examined the Bible, he noticed something that modern readers are rarely taught to see. The language changes dramatically from one section to another. Not just style, but worldview. Some passages describe God as distant and abstract. Others describe God walking, talking, regretting, and losing arguments. Some laws reflect nomadic tribal life. Others reflect settled urban societies that did not exist at the same time. This isn't a mystery when you allow one simple conclusion. The Bible is not one book written by one person at one time. It is a library, a collection of texts written by many authors across centuries, edited and re-edited to serve changing political needs. Once you accept that, something else becomes obvious. Characters are not always introduced because they existed. Sometimes they are introduced because they are useful. A character can embody an ideal. A character can justify a law. A character can model obedience, submission, patience, or fear. And once that character is placed in sacred history, questioning them becomes taboo. This is how control survives. Take authorship as an example. Tradition says Moses wrote the Torah. But the Torah describes Moses' death, burial, and the mourning that followed. It describes places by names they did not have during Moses' lifetime. It refers to kings of Israel before Israel ever had kings. These are not subtle details. They are clear signals that later writers were looking backward, organizing history from a much later vantage point. Spinoza pointed out that this does not make the text evil or worthless. It makes it human. But religious institutions could not allow that conclusion because their authority depended on divine dictation, not human composition. If Scripture was written by people, then people could question it. And if people could question it, priests lost their monopoly on truth. That is why Spinoza was dangerous. He did not tell people to abandon God. He told them to stop confusing God with a book. He argued that truth does not require secrecy, and that a real divine reality would survive examination, not collapse under it. That idea alone was enough to make him an enemy of every religious power structure in Europe. This figure is presented as the foundation of covenant, obedience, and faith itself. A man whose story is used to justify land claims, divine favoritism, and unquestioning submission. A man whose life, as described, collapses the moment you place it against history, geography, and logic. But the most explosive part of his work came when he moved beyond authorship and into character analysis. Spinoza noticed that certain figures in the Bible were not just exaggerated, they were structurally impossible. Their timelines did not align with known history. Their actions violated basic human limitations. Their stories contradicted each other across different books. And these contradictions were not the result of translation errors or lost manuscripts. They were baked into the narrative itself. This is where belief quietly turns into conditioning. When a child is taught that a figure lived hundreds of years, spoke directly with God, controlled nature, or shaped entire civilizations single-handedly, the lesson is not just about faith. It is about authority. It teaches the mind to accept impossibility without resistance. It trains obedience at a deep psychological level. Once the mind learns to accept one impossibility, accepting the next becomes easier. This is why these characters matter. They are not harmless stories. They are foundational tools. And once you examine them carefully, you begin to see that their function was never historical accuracy. Their function was behavioral control. Spinoza understood this centuries ago. He saw that these characters served as anchors for laws, hierarchies, and moral expectations. Remove the character and the structure above it begins to wobble. Question the existence, and the command loses its divine weight. That is why later editors worked so hard to smooth over contradictions, merge traditions, and silence alternative interpretations. It wasn't about preserving truth. It was about preserving power. And now we come to the first of the 7 figures Spinoza identified as impossible, not because he wanted to shock people, but because the evidence left him no choice. Before we examine him directly, pause for a moment and ask yourself something honestly. Have you ever felt a quiet discomfort reading these stories? A moment where the numbers didn't make sense, the timelines felt off, or the actions felt exaggerated beyond reality. And did you immediately silence that feeling because you were taught that doubt was dangerous? That instinct wasn't a weakness, it was awareness. In the next part, we will examine the first of the 7 impossible figures, not with mockery, not with hostility, but with calm, careful reasoning. We will look at what the text actually says, compare it to what we know about history, and let the evidence speak for itself. And once we do, you will understand why this question was never meant to be asked out loud. The first figure we need to examine is not chosen at random. He sits at the very foundation of biblical identity, covenant, and divine favoritism. His story is used to justify land ownership, ethnic election, obedience without evidence, and faith without proof. Remove him, and the structure above him begins to crack. question him, and everything built on his story starts to feel less solid. This figure is Abraham. According to the text, Abraham lived around the early 2nd millennium BCE. He is said to have left the city of Er, traveled vast distances, spoken directly with God multiple times, negotiated with God over the fate of cities, fathered nations at an advanced age, and lived well beyond normal human lifespan. His descendants are said to become entire peoples through whom God would work uniquely in history. This story is repeated so often that it feels familiar, even comforting. But familiarity is not evidence. And when you slow down and examine Abraham carefully, the problems begin almost immediately. Let's start with geography. The Bible claims Abraham came from Ir of the Chaldeans. The problem is that the Chaldeans did not exist as a people until nearly 1,000 years after Abraham is supposed to have lived. This is not a minor detail. It is a clear historical marker. Referring to Ar as of the Chaldeans places the author in a much later time period, looking backward and projecting contemporary political realities onto an imagined past. That alone tells us the story is not eyewitness history. It is a retrospective construction. Now consider the travel narrative. Abraham is said to move freely across massive regions, interacting with kings, pharaohs, tribal leaders, and city-states. Yet there is no archaeological evidence of a figure of his stature existing in any external record. No inscription, no treaties, no economic records, nothing. For a man presented as foundational to multiple nations, this silence is striking. Defenders often say, not everything was recorded. That's true. But influential figures involved in land, livestock, warfare, and alliances did leave traces. The absence here is not neutral, it is telling. Next, consider chronology. The ages given in Abraham's story stretch credibility beyond biological reality. He fathers Isaac at around 100 years old. His wife Sarah gave birth at 90. The text presents this as miraculous, but it also expects the reader to treat Abraham's broader life as historically normal. This creates a contradiction. Either we are dealing with mythic storytelling, or we are expected to suspend all biological limits selectively. And once you accept selective suspension, anything becomes possible. But the deeper issue is not age, it is a function. Abraham's story is structured to establish obedience as the highest virtue. He is praised not for wisdom, not for compassion, not for justice, but for submission. When told to leave his homeland, he obeys. When told his descendants will inherit land already inhabited, he does not question the ethics. When told to sacrifice his own son, he prepares to do it without protest. This is not an accident. This is not incidental characterization. This is psychological modeling. The message is clear. True faith means silencing your moral instincts when authority speaks. Now pause and think about that. A story where the hero is willing to kill his child because a voice tells him to is not morally neutral. It trains the audience to associate goodness with obedience, even when obedience violates basic human ethics. And once that association is formed, it becomes transferable. If Abraham obeyed God without question, then you should obey religious authority without question too. This is how stories shape behavior. When Spinoza examined this narrative, he did not ask, "Is this inspiring?" He asked, "Is this coherent?" And coherence is where the story fails. The text cannot decide whether Abraham knows God intimately or barely understands him. Sometimes Abraham argues with God, negotiating over Sodom. Other times he obeys silently, even when the command contradicts moral intuition. These inconsistencies suggest layered traditions, not a single historical personality. Then there is the covenant itself. God promises Abraham land stretching across vast regions, yet Abraham never possesses it. His descendants do not possess it for centuries, and even then, not in the way promised. The fulfillment is constantly deferred, reinterpreted, or spiritualized. A promise that requires endless reinterpretation is not a fulfilled promise. It is a narrative device. This is crucial. Promises in Scripture often function not as predictions but as tools. They bind the audience to the future. They create patience, endurance, and hope, even when reality contradicts expectation. A people waiting for fulfillment are easier to guide than a people grounded in the present. Abraham's story is the template for this psychology. Believe now, obey now. The reward will come later. Later never arrives. Another overlooked issue is Abraham's moral character. The text describes him lying about his wife, presenting her as his sister to protect himself, even when this places her in danger. This happens more than once, and yet the narrative never condemns him. Instead, God protects Abraham and punishes others. The moral message is subtle but powerful. Divine favor overrides ethical consistency. Again, this is not history speaking. This is ideology. A historical account would wrestle with these contradictions. A mythic account absorbs them without resistance because its purpose is not accuracy, but authority. Spinoza saw this clearly. He understood that Abraham was not written to be remembered. He was written to be obeyed through. Once you see that, the silence of external evidence, the anachronisms, the exaggerated lifespans, and the moral contradictions all point in the same direction. Abraham is not a historical anchor. He is a narrative foundation designed to carry a system of belief, and systems built on narrative foundations resist scrutiny by design. That is why questioning Abraham feels dangerous. It is not because the evidence is strong. It is because the structure above him depends on unquestioned acceptance. Remove the foundation and the walls begin to tremble. But Abraham is only the beginning. He sets the pattern. The next figures intensify it. Longer lifespans, bigger miracles, greater authority, deeper demands for obedience. And as the stories grow more impossible, the audience grows more conditioned. In the next part, we will examine a figure whose lifespan alone defies not just biology, but narrative consistency itself. A figure whose age is so extreme that even ancient writers struggled to keep the numbers straight. A figure whose existence serves one purpose: to stretch the imagination until resistance collapses. Before we continue, take a moment. Notice what just happened in your own mind. Did you feel tension? Discomfort? A desire to defend the story instinctively, even before evidence demanded it? That reaction is not accidental, it is learned. And once you recognize that, you are already thinking more freely than you were taught to. When you're ready, we move on. Before we look at names, pause and ask yourself a simple question. What would you need to do if you were trying to convince people that your stories were ancient, authoritative, and beyond challenge? You would push them as far back in time as possible. You would stretch human memory beyond living recollection. You would place your foundations so deep in the past that no one could check them, question them, or verify them. And the easiest way to do that would be through lifespans. This is where the patriarchs before the flood enter the story. According to Genesis, figures like Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Methuselah, and Noah lived for hundreds of years. Methuselah is said to have lived 969 years. Adam lived 930. Noah lived 950. These are not symbolic figures in the text. They are presented as literal ancestors with precise ages, fathers, sons, and death years listed in genealogies that are meant to be read as historical records. But here's the problem. There is no biological mechanism, none that allows human beings to live even half that long, let alone nearly a millennium. Not in ancient times, not now, not ever. And there is no evidence, anywhere in the archaeological or genetic record, of a population of long-lived humans gradually declining in lifespan over generations. Apologists often argue that conditions were different before the flood. The environment was purer. Human genetics were less degraded. Sin had not yet taken its toll. But these are not explanations. They are assertions layered on top of a story that already lacks evidence. And they introduce new problems. If lifespans declined because of sin or environmental change, we should see a clear and consistent pattern. Instead, the biblical record shows irregular drops and plateaus. Some generations lose hundreds of years suddenly. Others remain relatively stable. There is no smooth biological curve. There is no scientific coherence. What there is, however, is a literary pattern. Long lifespans are a known feature of ancient Near Eastern mythologies. The Sumerian king list, written long before Genesis, describes kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years before a great flood. After the flood, their reigns suddenly shrink to more believable lengths. This is important. The structure is the same. Extreme longevity in the mythical past, a cataclysmic event. Then shorter, more human lifespans afterward. The Bible does not invent this pattern, it adapts it. Spinoza noticed this immediately. He recognized that Genesis was not recording unique revelation. It was reshaping existing mythic material to serve a new theological narrative. The long lifespans are not there because the authors believed humans lived that long. They are there to create distance. Distance from verification. Distance from memory. Distance from challenge. When a story begins 900 years ago, there are no witnesses left to contradict it. And that is the point. Now consider Noah. Noah is presented as a righteous man in a corrupt world, chosen to preserve life through a global flood. Every living thing outside the ark is said to be destroyed. Humanity is reset. Civilization begins again through one family. This story is central to biblical theology. It explains why the world is broken. It justifies divine violence. It introduces the concept of collective punishment, and it establishes a pattern. Obedience leads to survival, disobedience leads to annihilation. But the flood story collapses under scrutiny. There is no geological evidence of a global flood in the time frame described. None. No global sediment layer. No simultaneous destruction of all human civilizations. In fact, we have continuous records of cultures that existed before, during, and after the supposed flood period, with no interruption. Then there is the logistical impossibility. An ark capable of holding representatives of every animal species, with sufficient food, waste management, and genetic diversity to repopulate the planet, is not just improbable. It is physically impossible given the dimensions described. Even if you remove modern species and reduce the number dramatically, the problem does not disappear. The math does not work. Biology does not work. The timeline does not work. So why include the story? Because it accomplishes several psychological goals at once. It frames God as absolute authority over life and death. It normalizes mass destruction as moral when commanded by authority. It creates a fear-based obedience model. And it resets genealogy, allowing the authors to compress history and reshape origins. Noah's extreme lifespan serves the same function as Adam's and Methuselah's. It pushes the narrative into unreachable time. It creates an illusion of antiquity. But there is another, more subtle function, the genealogy. The long lifespans allow genealogies to span vast periods with very few names. This creates the appearance of continuity while actually concealing gaps. Real human populations require branching, complexity, and diversity. The biblical genealogies flatten this complexity into neat lines that serve theological messaging rather than demographic reality. Spinoza saw this flattening as a literary construction, not a historical record. And here's where the internal contradictions appear. Different parts of the Bible give different ages for the same figures. The Masoretic text, the Septuagint, and the Samaritan Pentateuch all disagree on the lifespans and timelines, sometimes by centuries. Which version is divinely inspired? They cannot all be correct, but they can all be useful, depending on the agenda of the community preserving them. That is not how history behaves. That is how tradition behaves. Now step back. If Adam, Methuselah, and Noah are not historical figures as described, and the evidence strongly suggests they are not, then the foundation of original sin, inherited guilt, and divine reset collapses. No Adam means no literal fall. No global flood means no divine cleansing. No genealogical continuity means no neat moral inheritance, and without those, much of later theology loses its justification. This is why these figures are protected so fiercely. They are not just stories. They are load-bearing myths. Spinoza understood that attacking later figures would be pointless if the foundation remained unquestioned. So he began at the beginning. And once the beginning breaks, everything built on it becomes negotiable. But the Bible does not stop with ancient patriarchs. It escalates. In the next part, we will examine a figure who is said to have spoken directly with God, performed miracles on a national scale, and authored the very law that defines obedience itself. A figure whose existence is essential for the authority of every commandment that follows. A figure whose story collapses the moment you read it carefully. If there is one figure the entire biblical system cannot survive without, it is Moses. Remove Adam and theology becomes unstable. Remove Noah, and divine judgment loses its precedent. But remove Moses and authority itself collapses, because Moses is not just a character in a story. Moses is the delivery mechanism. He is the bridge between heaven and law, between divine will and human obedience. Every commandment, every statute, every moral obligation in the Hebrew Bible traces back to one claim. God spoke to Moses, and Moses wrote it down. So here is the question that Spinoza dared to ask, knowing full well it would cost him everything. What if Moses never existed as described? Or more precisely, what if the Moses of the Bible is a literary construction rather than a historical individual? Not a misunderstood man, not an exaggerated leader, but a composite figure assembled to legitimize law after the fact. Let's start with something deceptively simple. The Bible tells us Moses wrote the Torah, all 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. But the Torah describes Moses in the third person. It narrates his thoughts, his emotions, his mistakes. It describes events that happen after his death. It records his burial and then immediately continues the story. That alone should stop the conversation. No historical document written by a single author behaves this way, especially not one claiming divine dictation. But the problems go deeper. The Torah repeatedly uses phrases like "to this day," referring to customs, landmarks, and political realities that existed long after Moses' supposed lifetime. It references cities that archaeology shows were not inhabited until centuries later. It assumes a settled agricultural society when Moses' people are supposedly wandering nomads. This is not subtle. This is not a hidden scholarship. It is anachronism layered on anachronism. Spinoza pointed out that the text reflects the concerns, language, and worldview of a much later period, specifically the era of the Israelite monarchy and post-exilic community. In other words, the Torah reads like a constitution written backward, projecting authority into the past to control the present. And that changes everything. Because if Moses did not receive the law directly from God, then the law is not divine command. It is human legislation. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Who benefits from believing the law came from heaven? The answer is always the same: those who enforce it. The Exodus story illustrates this perfectly. According to the Bible, Moses leads hundreds of thousands of enslaved Israelites out of Egypt through a series of catastrophic plagues. Egypt's economy collapses. Its firstborn children die. The sea splits. An entire army is drowned. A massive population wanders the desert for 40 years, receiving food from the sky and water from rocks. And yet there is no archaeological evidence for any of this. No Egyptian records of a slave population collapse. No mass graves. No inscription. No destruction layers. No sudden demographic vacuum. Egyptian record-keeping was obsessive, especially when it came to disasters and military victories. And yet the Exodus is absent, completely. Apologists argue that Egyptians wouldn't record their defeats. But this explanation fails on 2 counts. First, the plagues would have devastated the entire society, not just the military. Second, Egyptian records include defeats, famines, and humiliations elsewhere. Silence here is not suspicious. It is decisive. And then there is the wilderness problem. If hundreds of thousands of people wandered the Sinai for 40 years, they would leave traces: campsite, tools, bones, fire pit, waste, cemetery. There are none, not one. The Sinai has been studied extensively. What we find are small nomadic movements consistent with known patterns, not a displaced nation sustained by miracles. So why tell the story? Because it does something powerful psychologically. It frames identity around liberation granted by obedience. It establishes law as a gift from a savior figure. It teaches that freedom comes not from autonomy, but from submission to a higher authority mediated by a chosen leader. And Moses embodies that mediator role perfectly. He speaks to God face to face, but the people cannot. He receives the law, but they must obey. He intercedes when God is angry, but only temporarily. This structure ensures dependence. You don't question God because God is distant. You don't question the law because it's divine. You don't question the mediator because without him you are lost. Spinoza recognized this as a political theology. The laws attributed to Moses reflect concerns of land ownership, priestly power, ritual purity, and centralized worship, exactly the concerns of a settled society trying to maintain control after exile. In other words, the law looks like it was written to manage people, not reveal cosmic truth. And here is the final crack. The Bible itself contradicts Moses' uniqueness. In Deuteronomy, it says no prophet like Moses ever arose again until the time it was written. That phrase only makes sense if the author is looking back across history, which means Moses is already long gone, which means the claim that Moses wrote this is false. And if that claim is false, then the authority of the law rests not on divine revelation, but on tradition insisting it is divine. This is the moment where many people feel fear rising. Because if Moses is not who you were told he was, then obedience becomes optional. Guilt becomes negotiable. Fear loses its teeth. And that is why this story is defended so aggressively, not because it is fragile, but because it is effective. Spinoza understood something that terrified every religious authority of his time. Truth does not require fear to survive, only power does. And power depends on stories that cannot be questioned. That is why Spinoza was cursed. That is why his books were banned. That is why his ideas were buried for centuries. Not because they were wrong, but because they worked. They taught people how to read. And once you learn how to read like this, slowly, carefully, without reverence, you don't just see 7 impossible characters. You see the mechanism. You see how narrative becomes law, how myth becomes morality, how fear becomes obedience. And once you see that, the spell breaks, not into chaos, but into clarity. You don't lose meaning, you regain it. You don't lose ethics, you reclaim them. You don't lose wonder, you remove fear from it. That is why Spinoza said that understanding God through reason was the highest form of devotion, not worship, understanding. So now the responsibility shifts. Because once you see the invention, you have a choice. You can cling to the comfort of stories that were designed to manage you. Or you can step into the quiet, unsettling freedom of thinking for yourself. No threats, no curses, no eternal punishments, just truth, and the courage to face it. If you're still here, you already know which path you're on. Welcome to the other side of the story.